On the many issues related to memory that certainly seem to prompt an angry response from the president and from his advocates, is there anything being done to address that issue in an ongoing way? Obviously, Counsel wrote asking for some of those things to be removed. It is potential that Robert Hur could be called before Congress to testify in public. Are there any steps that the administration would take addressing that specific issue? Is it in relation to overall medical physician's report of the president or other things to demonstrate what is the issue with memory, and is it a factor that deals with his capacity to serve?
Well, I have a lot of issues with the contents of that question, and Kareen's answered a lot about the president's transparency in his medical record. I can't explain why the report veers all over the place on this issue. I can just say, and as you've heard from the vice president, you heard from members of Congress yesterday talking about their recent interactions with the president. One, Congressman Goldman from New York, talking about his interaction with the president the day before this interview, when Congressman Goldman was on the ground in Israel, and the long and intensive and detailed conversation they had about what was going on the ground. We just reject that this is true. And I think that it does raise questions about the gratuitousness, and it raises, makes you wonder why that's in there.
The memory lapses that President Biden is described as having in this report, this is not the first time anybody's raised issues of President Biden's acuity. And in fact, twice this week, President Biden referenced European leaders, conversations he had with them in 2021 when both those European leaders had long been dead. He confused Macron with Mitterrand. He confused Helmut Kohl with Angela Merkel. Are you really acting as if there's nothing to these issues or these concerns?
Well, I saw from the White House counsel that they disputed this recollection of the interview. And I will tell you, Jake, I was in Israel on October 7th, as you know, and President Biden was nice enough to call me. And I can tell you, this was the day before that interview, I can tell you he was sharper than anyone I've spoken to about a very complex geopolitical urgent issue.
You had just mentioned how these interviews happened shortly after the October 7th attacks. The president mentioned it last night. In mentioning that, does that mean that possible memory lapses happened because he was so distracted by what was happening overseas? Or do you dispute that he had any memory issues during those hours of interviews?
I dispute that the characterizations about his memory that were in the report are accurate, because they're not. And he was trying his best to answer questions in this interview because he wanted to be fully cooperative.
So there were no memory lapses during...
I think there's something important that people should remember about the way that sort of interviews like this happen. I think probably in almost every prosecutorial interview you can imagine that people have said that they don't recall things because that's what they're instructed to do. So I think that's just important context to keep in mind.